Welcome to the Packer Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Herrick, and I sit down with leaders and disruptors in the fresh produce industry who are reimagining how we grow, move, and deliver fruits and vegetables in a changing world. And joining me today is Frank Yiannas, former FDA Deputy Commissioner. So I bet you can guess what we're going to talk about. Welcome, Frank.
Hey, Christina, it's good to be back. It's been a while.
It has. I think so. I think you're. Is it 2 times now?
This is my second time on the podcast, but I'm a fan of it. So.
Oh, well, thank you. I love flattery, especially when it's recorded. I'm kidding. But, we talked before we hit record, we set up this obviously just because food safety is a timely and a timely conversation. But then the FDA had an announcement that came out last week. So it's almost a perfect time to get you on the podcast and talk about this. So talk about the FSMA 204 delay and kind of like how you're interpreting this delay in terms of enforcement requirements and like the message and all of that. Talk a little bit about what you're reading.
Yeah, I think you're right. I know we started communicating saying, hey, let's do a podcast on this topic. And then we got the announcement through a constituent update last week. I just really briefly, Christina, I want to remind your readers how we've gotten here. And I think some of your listeners will know advancing food traceability is part of my lifetime mission. I did it both when I worked at Walmart, some of the traceability requirements, and then I went to the FDA in 2018. But it's important that we remember that in 2011, when the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law by President Obama, passed in a bipartisan manner, believe it or not, Republicans and Democrats working together, Congress had always directed FDA to write a food traceability rule. People refer to that as FSMA Section 204. The FDA was really busy, so it's no criticism of them. FSMA was a big endeavor. They never got around to writing the rule in a timely manner, and they were sued. They were sued by 2 consumer groups. When I went to the agency in 2018, we settled the lawsuit. And we agreed with the group that sued us that, yeah, you're right. Congress had requested that we write the rule. It's necessary because in every big outbreak that happens, oftentimes we see that a lack of traceability is what I call an Achilles heel. And we got a long history of saying, hey, we've got to get better at food traceability, whether it was 2006 spinach, whether it was 2009 PCA, and all the products that had PCA containing paste as an ingredient. Fast forward to 2018, we saw the romaine outbreaks. And even in my tenure at FDA, whether it was flour or seafood, food traceability has always been a challenge. And so we wrote the rule, we issued the final rule, we did it in a very democratic fashion, and we said there will be a compliance date of January 2026. So the industry has been, many, working very hard to try to comply with that. And then lo and behold, with the change in administration, and especially with last week's announcements, we hear, hey, the compliance date has been extended by 30 months to the summer, July of 2028. Now, what message does that send? I've been following this my entire career. I think you have to be sympathetic to say, hey, the rule was a big ask. It's a big lift. Maybe people need more time than January 2026. I think I can understand that. I don't understand some of the arguments coming specifically out of one trade association that says, do we even need a traceability law code? And the answer is yes. Anybody that's worked tracebacks or outbreaks knows that you do need a traceability law code. But I think more time, we could say, okay, that seems reasonable. We anticipated it when I was at FDA. But Christina, the point I want your listeners to know is there was different ways that FDA could have gotten there. In my view, they selected the wrong tool. One was extending the compliance date to 2028. Another tool that they could have used, and I would advocate for, and had I been there, I would have been advocating strongly, which is, well, let's provide the industry more time with something that we call enforcement discretion. The compliance date goes into effect, but you stay true to that FSMA mandate of educating before and while we regulate, and give the industry certainty, maybe even in written form, that we would grant enforcement discretion for a period of time afterwards. And so you could have given them more time. Now, why do I think those 2 methods are vastly different? The extending of the compliance date by 30 months. For some, not for all, there are some actors and actresses out there that saying we're still plowing ahead. A lot of the big retailers are doing so. But for those that want to hear what they want to hear, they've they tap the brakes a little bit too hard, and people are stopping some. Um, had you used enforcement discretion, I think it would have kept people moving along in making advancements. Now, the good news, I think the industry is figuring it out. This rule isn't going to change. FDA has said, we're not going to change the rule. They've been very clear, both in writing and verbally. And they said that multiple times. So I hope they remain true to what they've said. And they stay to that ethics and integrity and principle of repeatedly telling us that the rule is not going to change. It's just a little bit more time. But the good news is that industry has a little bit more time, and I strongly advocate that they use that time and don't stop what they're doing and work on it, because July of 2028 will be here before you know it.
Yes, and I think, as you were talking about that delayed enforcement, I think that was what I was hearing when the date was still going to be January of 2026. That was the intention, is once that date hit, there was going to be a bit of a educate, delayed enforcement, get everyone up to speed. I don't want to speculate. Clearly, I am not speaking on behalf of the FDA here, but it sounds almost like there may not be that delayed enforcement, at least in the announcement I read. Now, there's obviously going to be so much more information coming out in the future, so I don't want to speculate, but just kind of interesting, different approach there.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is there's precedent for that delayed enforcement, what we call enforcement discretion, when we rolled out the intentional adulteration rule. The rule had a compliance date. We didn't waive the compliance date, but we did tell the industry, listen, our first time around, we're not going to be citing you for this. We know this is new. And so, it seems like this language that we used a lot at the agency is no longer being used of educate before and while we regulate. And so anyways, it is water under the bridge. The traceability rule cannot be delayed one day longer than the July 2028. I mean, we need it. I did an exercise just a couple of weeks ago, Christina, where I looked at all of the outbreaks that FDA investigate and has closed for this year, 2025. And of the outbreaks that they've closed, it means they're no longer working on them. 60% of them, for 60% of the outbreaks, one of the gold standards, the US FDA had investigated, they could not identify the food responsible for those outbreaks. Now, traceability alone would have solved, I think, a lot of them. Maybe there's other factors that contributed to being unable to identify the food. But, my point is this. We live in a day and age where we have whole genome sequence. And the analogy I use, we can find needles in the haystack cases of foodborne illness across the country. We know they're linked because they have the same genetic match, which is a good thing. And I hope we continue to invest and make advancements in public health surveillance. So we can find the needles in the haystack, but we can't find the haystacks, the foods from which these pathogens came from. And so we can't delay this any longer than July of 2028. And if you say that you're for radical transparency, as we hear a lot of leaders say these days, you can't be for radical transparency and against food traceability. That's an oxymoron.
Yeah, and I think you kind of talked about this before, but let's talk about this momentum. So, the industry was moving forward up until March when, we got the notification that there was an intent to delay. And you kind of said this is not a time for the industry to take a 30-month pass and start working on this later, but is that a risk in this delay in enforcement? And then, talk about those barriers to compliance too.
Yeah. So the first question, is it a risk? Yeah, I think there's going to be primarily, you can think of two broad groups, probably a spectrum in between, but you have those companies that have already cited, hey, we're going to continue to move forward. Granted, we got extra time, we're going to use this time. And in fact, some retailers haven't even changed their compliance dates, which were, earlier ahead of the original January 2026 date, which is a good thing. But there are some companies that are going to now, they've tapped the brakes so hard, they're going to wait and see. And I do think it causes some, I think, unfortunately, to speculate, well, if the rule was delayed once and there's questions about the rule, I've had them tell me this, how can we be sure they won't delay it again, or they won't significantly change the rule or drop the rule? And so that's the unfortunate consequence for some, I think, in the food industry, that the way the FDA has done this, it can cast a lot of doubt for those reluctant organizations that didn't want to do this in the first place. And so I think it was the wrong compliance tool or the wrong compliance solution personally. But what remains out there, why does it continue to be a challenge? It was a big change. It's one of the most unique rules in food safety modernization in that it requires data to be captured and data to be shared. A lot of the rules were how do you operate your establishment and does it conform to these standards? So it involves data sharing, which is a little bit complex. Um, I think the biggest barriers are, change is always hard. Uh, People are generally reluctant. And I think another big barrier is I think a lot in the industry are underestimating the value that better traceability will bring. When we wrote the rule, we did a cost benefit analysis, and on balance, we believe the rule will save the nation, the food system, our society at large dollars because we'll be able to solve outbreaks quicker, prevent outbreaks, prevent these overly broad recalls that we've all seen over the course of the past decade, recalling foods that we doubt are involved or affecting the livelihoods of farmers who we know products aren't unaffected. We've seen repeatedly in these outbreaks, when you trace them back, it's a source, yet everybody that grew to the commodity got damaged. So we think there's a benefit. But what I saw in my private sector days, Christina, was that the benefits of better food traceability or the value of better food traceability go beyond food safety. I've always said the value of food safety is just icing on the top. It's running smarter supply chains. We had data at the retailer that I worked at. When you ran smarter supply chain through better transparency and traceability, you reduce shrink. You gave days of shelf life back to the customer. Happier customer, better sales. And so there's a lot of positive benefits. So I think those are some of the barriers. But if you get a little bit more tactical in the rule itself, I think the biggest barrier is that last mile. When I was at FDA and I would meet with constituents, the farmers and the retailers would always point fingers. But I think the growers had it right. The most difficult part of this is that last mile, which is requiring traceability at the DC, what's received at distribution centers, and what product by lot or used by date, et cetera, is shipped to point of service. And thus there's restaurants and grocery stores around the country. And having been responsible for food policy and response, the response part of FDA, I can tell you that in so many outbreaks, it was that last mile. We couldn't get good data on what was actually received at a restaurant or at a grocery store. There were always these estimates. And that's why I say those people that say that you don't require capturing a traceability lot code at point of service just don't know. I hate to be so blunt. They just don't know because they really haven't tried to do this work.
And I think too, as you were talking, I'm thinking about just, I've heard challenges in that data sharing part, which is obviously, as you talked about, it is really, I think the change here is that, it's not just that you're keeping track of your data, you have to be able to pass that data on. And, whether you're at the beginning in the grower stage or somewhere in between, you have to be able to find that data and be able to move it forward. And that I think is a big change. And
Yeah.
I think really probably what's holding the industry, I don't want to say holding the industry back, but is really making this compliance hard is that probably there's some pen and paper data out there. I hope not at this point with technology, but trying to move that into the future and having that as something that can be shared with trading partners and with suppliers, I think is a critical part of it. But that I guess that gives us 30 months to prepare, and I say us collectively as the industry, but
Sure.
there's another 30 months to get ready.
Sure, I agree with you.
Yeah, so you also talked about voluntary traceability and voluntary industry initiatives, and you talked about a lot of the retail partners that we've seen that have come out and said, their compliance dates aren't changing. Where does that fit into this big traceability picture?
Yeah, I think voluntary initiatives are really important. They've been important, Christina, for food safety in general my entire career. A lot of the great things that have happened in food safety, I've spent a career both in the public and private sector. And people often don't give the private sector enough credit for some of the great things that have happened. Uh, I'll get to traceability with certainty, but let me tell you, we all use HACCP as the framework of managing food safety risk. Well, HACCP wasn't given to us by a regulatory agency. If you recall, it was born by Pillsbury and NASA working together to create a new paradigm for risk management of foods. So the private sector played a really important role, and it was voluntary. Um, for traceability, it has too. And in particular, I do want to give credit to nonprofit GS1 and the GS1 standards. That isn't required by law, it's voluntary, but, industry has gotten together and said, hey, we need standards to be able to track and trade products so we can do commerce. And GS1 is voluntary, but I can tell you when we wrote the food traceability rule, and we had men and women who said, Deputy Commissioner Yiannas, these are the data attributes that we need to be able to track food in a foodborne outbreak. One of the things I asked them to do based on my tenure in the private sector was, well, because they didn't have a lot of awareness of this, I said, go study the GS1 standards and do a crosswalk with what you're asking for now for food traceability versus what they do for tracking foods for commercial purposes, just to know what foods are being bought and sold and shipped and what's needed in inventories. And I can tell you the food traceability rule, the key data elements and the critical tracking events align very well and closely with a voluntary standard that's used by the industry, an industry consensus standard for commerce. And so we're not asking for that much more for food traceability. I think there were two data attributes that were unique. The data attributes of a product description and ship to and ship from and the number of units, all that's already there in the GS1 standards that people are voluntarily adopting to do commerce. The only two data attributes that were truly unique in the FDA food traceability rule were traceability lot codes. Because Christina, what we saw is for some reason in our sector, everybody wanted to sign their own lot. Whether it was the grower would have their own lot, and then a distributor would have their own lot, and then a retailer might have their own lots. And we said, hey, the original person that makes the food, if the food isn't transformed, you're responsible for assigning a traceability lot code. And don't change it unless the food truly changes. So that was one of the things that was unique, which makes a lot of sense in traceability lot code. So I think voluntary standards will continue to pave the way. I've always said, and I believe this, and I hate to admit how many years I've been doing this now. I'm going on my 40th year in the profession. Food traceability and food transparency and smarter supply chains were going to happen with or without this rule. Just it's the world that we live in. We're living in the data age. We saw how not having good insights into supply chains during the pandemic can wreak havoc. And I'm just happy that there are voluntary initiatives and voluntary standards that are making a regulation, the food traceability rule, easier to comply with.
Yes, and I think it is interesting to see kind of some of these retailers, some of this, other folks in the industry playing a role in kind of moving this forward, even though we've got that 30-month official compliance delay. Wow. I feel like I can have you on and talk to you for a full hour here. So let's talk about some of the risks that fresh produce face in terms of food safety, and talk about is part of that just the fact that our global food and fresh produce supply is so complicated now. Where do you see those risks, and talk about the global nature of our supply and where that fits in with traceability.
Okay. Yeah, let's tackle the risk first. I'm a strong proponent, and I hope everybody's a strong proponent. We want Americans to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables. We're under this "Make America Healthy Again." You can't make America healthy again without a balanced diet that has a good dose of fresh fruits and vegetables. They're really good for you. And the reality is, Christina, you know this very well because of the business that you're in. The vast majority of time that consumers sit down to enjoy fresh fruits and vegetables, they're safe. Even leafy greens, I've heard statistics such as 150 million servings of fresh leafy greens consumed safely every day. But having stated that, when these outbreaks occur at times, food attribution studies done by the CDC and FDA and USDA and public health authorities say oftentimes they're linked to produce. Now, your listeners know why. Produce is generally grown outdoors and subject to contamination from a wide variety of sources. Um, I think in some areas of the produce sector, produce is pretty broad. In some areas of produce sector, they've made tremendous advancements. Fresh leafy greens in general, the advancements that have been made since 2018 are just incredible. You see people paying more attention to ag water. You see traceability already done pretty well in certain commodities. But if you talk about produce risk, I think uh, the way I answer it is I don't know if you've read this book called Atomic Habits, but it's a pretty good book. And they talked about trying to get this racing team in Europe that was performing pretty low up to a higher standard. And they conclude that there wasn't any single thing you could do. It wasn't just the bikes, it wasn't just the tires, it wasn't just the helmets, it just wasn't the uniform. It was a lot of things you have to do. And when it comes to produce safety, I kind of concluded the same uh, deal, which is there's no one single thing that you can do to improve produce safety. There's a lot of things you have to get right. But I think there's some basic ones that we just have to stay laser focused on and do a better job in a wider variety of produce commodities. Because, we've been talking about fresh leafy greens so much. We've seen over the past few years onions pop up. We know there are challenges occasionally with fresh herbs, and, we can go down the list. But I think the one that we need to be laser focused on is water. And I know FDA has a pre-harvest ag water standard. We worked on it when I was at FDA, but I can't tell you how many times we have seen outbreaks with a water link. And so agricultural water is critical. The importance of water quality and safety has been known since antiquity. The Romans knew that, the Greeks knew that, and we need to make sure that we do a better job with that in general. I would say the basic ones that we just have to get right every time: water, adjacent land use, and it's a difficult conversation because agricultural, what I call ecosystems, are diverse and they vary across the country, and you know growers of produce and people that raise livestock have to coexist, but we have to pay more attention to adjacent land use and whether something adjacent to your growing field could be a challenge. That would be the next big one. And then soil amendments. You can go on and on and on. But I think if we got some of the basics right, some of these outbreaks that we've seen over the years could have been prevented. In terms of the global nature and what it means to food traceability, the rule was written, Christina, so that these key data elements and critical tracking events get shared at what we call both shipping and receiving events. So I think the rule can deal with, a more global nature of a supply chain if we bring foreign producers up to speed. I think it can deal with, whether it's 3 layers deep or 4 layers deep. Again, I think the most challenging thing with produce traceability is that last mile distribution to point of service.
Mm.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but I love that analogy of, I don't want to say a sports team because this was actually a cycling team, but just it's all the little things that add up to something bigger. It's not just
That's right.
one big change, which is really interesting. But now this is a horrible segue, but this is what's popped into my head is, let's talk about big change. Let's talk about where you see food safety heading in the future. What does a modern food safety world look like, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually do believe, there's this quote that I've used before. It's worth using again that says the pace of change has never been this fast and it'll never be this slow again. Just think about our own lives and how the pace of change and the technologies that we use at home. I grew up at the Disney company and there was 3 major television networks. Disney owned ABC, and we would watch news one time a day, generally in the evening news at 6:30, and there were 3 channels you could watch: ABC, NBC, CBS. And now look at the world that we live today, as you can get any information you want anytime at your fingertips. Um, I do believe that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we're going to look back and we're going to think that the way food safety professionals had been doing their work is a little bit silly. Kind of like our kids, look back at how we grew up. And I think there's three big themes that I think are transformational. One is just the era of digitalization and big data. I think that's game changing. Uh, Genomics and all that we're learning on genomics and metagenomics is coming. But we know the power of genomics and whole genome sequencing. And then the other one that I think will be big for produce, Christina, is just the revolution that we're going to see in automation. Automation. And briefly, I say data, I've often said that better food safety begins and ends with better data. And so a world where anything that's physical can be digital, and we can capture digital data about it, whether it's production of how we produce crops and the many variables that are needed, fertilization and water and soil conditions and weather conditions and climate, whether it's IoT devices. We're already seeing this. We're seeing IoT devices on harvest equipment. Well, we can tell where a harvester has been. If you would ask me that 5 years ago, I would have said, wow, that's game changing. Because we would ask, did these farms share equipment? Well, now we'll have maps of where the harvester was and when it was being used. And so I think all of that will allow us to do better risk prioritization. And I see a world where rather than saying we have to do the once a year audit, we have multiple streams of data that we better convert to information and make connections that we don't know are there. And we can go to more dynamic risk prioritization and using machine learning, even more predictive kind of perspectives on where might there be a problem. And so I think that's going to be game changing. Metagenomics, we're going to find out in time that, we've studied bacterial isolates generally in pure form. I'm a microbiologist, but with metagenomics, we're going to understand more about the other organisms that are there that are not the pathogens and their role in how the pathogen behaves, survives, or thrives. And I did one bit of work in a controlled environmental agriculture facility. And we know that how you maintain the water quality in those nutrient ponds can make the difference whether a pathogen gets introduced and survives or doesn't survive. And then I would just say on the automation, one of the reasons I believe we continue to see outbreaks to this day is that the food industry still relies on what I call administrative controls, meaning it requires people to do the right thing at the right time. And with automation, we can rely a little bit more on what I describe as engineering controls, having equipment and machinery. Now, having stated that, I think automation gives us great hope, but we needed to make sure that we have a seat at the table and that these automation methods aren't done in a manner that sacrifices food safety. So I'm a big fan of the automation revolution that's coming ahead, but food safety professionals must have a seat at the table.
Well, I'm going to have to bring you on the podcast again, and maybe we'll just talk about the future of food safety and talk about, I feel like the advances, at least that I've seen in ag tech, for as long as I've been with the Packer, it's just exponential. It blows my mind how quickly things are changing and rapidly improving, and just making a difference. So I feel like we'll have to do a whole podcast to explore.
I would love that. Love that.
Well, I've hit the end of our tough questions, and now it's the fun, fresh take questions. So are you up for it?
I'm up for it. In fact, I knew you were going to ask me something unusual, and I'm going to reveal something, a little inside secret, Christina, that I've never revealed publicly in a large way.
I'm looking forward to this. All right. Well, let's start with that. So if you weren't, I guess, doing what you do now, working in food safety, what would your dream job be?
Yeah, I love food safety. And so I have no reservations. If I look back and I had to do it all over again, I'd gladly do this. But if I'm just candidly 100% transparent with you, I mean, I always, growing up, hoped to be a New York Yankees professional baseball player. So I probably would have stuck at it a little bit. My dream job would have been to be a New York Yankee shortstop or second baseman. So, and at my age, because your shelf life in being a professional athlete is pretty short, then maybe turning into a coach. But I'm a big fan of the New York Yankees, and I love baseball.
kind of think you're a food safety coach. I mean, it's not the same thing, but instead of working for one team, you're kind of coaching all of us.
Thank you.
So if you could instantly fix one challenge, and I feel like this one I maybe shouldn't even ask you because I think you're going to say food safety, but if you could instantly fix one challenge in the fresh produce industry, what would it be?
Well, it's a great question because, I'm glad that you picked up that I said, hey, and I use that analogy. There isn't no single one thing, but the one thing I wish everybody would get right is making sure that the quality and safety of the water they use, whether it was pre-harvest or post, was perfect, sound. Because just over the course of my career, too many times, water has played an important role as a conduit of spreading contamination. So that one's really high on my list. And I would tell you, if we got it right all the time, there'd be less produce-related illnesses.
That's so interesting. All right, last of the fresh take questions. So, what's something inside of ag or outside of it that you think more people should be paying attention to?
Inside or outside, there's so many things. Yeah, I mean,
I know it's a broad question, but
yeah, no, it's hard.
a
But
podcast, a TV show, you name it. Can you use your imagination?
um, the thing that probably concerns me the most that we should be paying attention to is food prices. I think there isn't any more powerful disruptive force to society than food prices, and we've seen them inch up. And I know some people think, oh, well, we don't pay enough for our food. I don't agree with those kind of thoughts, anyways. We've seen food prices inch up in the pandemic. Unfortunately, they still seem to be inching up, and there's reasons. I'm not being critical of food producers, but we need to be able to produce volumes of safe, healthy, and affordable food. And if society or a nation can't do that, it's probably the best predictor of problems.
That's a great point. And that's I think you're right. I mean, you're here. We're talking to the audience that I hope believes strongly in getting access to fresh produce, safe fresh produce as much as possible. So, yeah, that's a good point. Well, that's it. You survived the fresh take.
That's okay, Christina. It was a pleasure being back on. I hope you invite me back. I love to spend some time talking about the future of food safety and the
Yes,
future in general, a bit of a future. And I'll close with a Yogi Berra quote, who was an old New York Yankee, who
appropriate.
said, "The future is not what it used to be."
That's a very good point, and it's apropos for you. Your dreams of being on the Yankees. Well, thank you again for joining me, Frank. Yes, I will invite you back on. We'll coordinate. We'll find a time because like I said, I could talk to you for hours, and I feel like you are such a great wealth of knowledge. So that's it for today's episode, brought to you by the Packer Produce Market Guide and Farm Journal. Don't forget, if you like what you hear, you can catch new episodes of the Packer Podcast. And we'd also love for you to take a moment to rate and review the show. If you like it, please let us know. And be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for tuning in and for all you do to keep fresh produce moving from field to table. Bye.